On a Tuesday that smelled of rain and old paper, my son stood in my doorway, his tie still perfectly knotted from work, and said the words that split something deep inside me. "Dad, you don't belong in business." He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, didn't even look angry. And that was what made it worse. Anger leaves room for argument. Certainty leaves no door to push open. His tone was calm, cold, like a judge delivering a verdict already written long before the trial. I stood there, gripping the frame of the door, as if holding on to wood could keep me from drowning in that moment. He didn't mean business, as in just deals and numbers. I knew that. He meant the world he now lived in, the place where I had once believed hard work and honesty mattered. He was telling me I didn't belong in his world anymore, and perhaps, in his mind, I never had. Rain tapped against the window behind him, steady, deliberate, the way his words had been. My mind flicked through years of sacrifice, the second jobs I'd taken to pay for his business school, the nights I came home too late for dinner but early enough to see him still awake, working on his first business plans. I had been the silent scaffold holding him up, and now I was being told I had no place in the building. I wanted to speak, to remind him of the nights he cried over deals gone wrong, the mornings I encouraged him when the numbers didn't make sense, the days I pretended not to see his mistakes because I believed in the man he could become. But all that sat heavy in my chest, unmoving. He glanced at his watch, as if the conversation was an item to tick off his schedule. "I have to go. Big meeting," he said. His shoes clicked against the floor as he walked away, leaving the faint scent of his cologne, sharp, expensive, and nothing like the boy who once smelled of sawdust and motor oil when he helped me in my workshop. When the door closed, I stayed still for a long moment, not because I was stunned, but because I knew something had shifted. The rain outside had turned heavier, and I could feel it inside me too. Not just disappointment, not just hurt. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more dangerous. It was the beginning of a promise I hadn't even made to myself yet. A promise that one day he would see exactly where I belonged, and it wouldn't be in the shadows. Friends, let me take a short pause. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. For years, I lived in the quiet shadows of my own sacrifices, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed my role was to build a platform for him to stand on. I had carried bricks when no one else would, stayed late in jobs I didn't love so he could chase dreams he hadn't even fully shaped yet. Every extra hour I worked, every coin I tucked away, every chance I passed by was poured into the foundation of his future. And for a while, that was enough for me. In the early days, he would come to me with sketches of ideas on napkins, hands smudged with ink, eyes bright with possibility. I'd listen, nod, and then quietly find a way to get him what he needed. A loan, a contact, a second chance when the first had failed. My victories were measured in his opportunities, my pride in the sound of his name spoken with respect by others. But slowly, something changed. The thanks turned into assumptions. The calls for help turned into calls for approval. And then, the calls became fewer altogether. My presence at his side was no longer a pillar. It was an afterthought. People around him began to look through me rather than at me. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for recognition. But recognition is not the same as existence. Without it, you begin to wonder if you've become a ghost in your own life. Family gatherings shifted. Conversations no longer lingered on my stories. They floated around his successes, his ventures, his travels. I'd smile and nod in the background, the way one does when you don't want to disrupt a scene that isn't yours anymore. It wasn't jealousy that gnawed at me. It was the slow erosion of being seen. I became the man people remembered only when they needed something fixed, signed, or funded. The rest of the time, I was furniture in the room, solid, dependable, but unnoticed. Even my son's eyes, once quick to search for mine when he needed reassurance, now slid past me as if my place was in the corner, observing rather than participating. The world outside saw me as retired, irrelevant, an aging man whose prime had long passed. But what no one knew was that my prime had been given away piece by piece to help someone else climb. I had spent decades turning myself into a stepping stone, only to watch the person I'd lifted higher pretend I was never part of the ground they stood on. And yet, beneath that quiet erasure, something in me remained unbroken, small, stubborn, and patient. I didn't know it yet, but that ember would one day burn bright enough to light an entire building. When he got the call, his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy winning his first school award. The position was at a company with glass towers that caught the sun like they owned the daylight, the kind of place where polished floors reflected every ambition and every misstep. To him, this was more than a job, it was validation, proof that he was part of what he called real business, the kind, he believed, I could never truly grasp. I stood in the doorway of his apartment as he told me the news, my hands resting loosely in my pockets, my smile as steady as I could make it. Inside, I felt the faint sting of distance forming, a door quietly swinging shut, not in anger, but in quiet certainty. He was stepping into a world that had no intention of making room for me. He started wearing sharper suits, speaking in acronyms and strategies I wasn't supposed to know, arriving at family dinners with his phone still warm from the last call. His laughter had a new rhythm to it, one that seemed tuned to different company than mine. When I asked about his work, his answers grew shorter, more polished, as if rehearsed for an audience I didn't belong to. And yet I watched. Proud, yes, but also aware that with each promotion, each networking event, the thread between us thinned. I caught glimpses of him in social media photos, standing beside executives in crisp lighting, holding champagne flutes, his smile carrying the confidence of someone who believed he'd found his place. My place, it seemed, had become the shadows at the edge of his spotlight. Once, years earlier, he had told me that the best deals were made in quiet rooms, away from the noise. I had lived my entire working life believing that, but now his definition of quiet seemed to mean a room where I wasn't invited. I told myself it was fine, that he was building something of his own, that a father's role was to let go when the time came. But deep down, there was a truth I couldn't ignore. Letting go felt different when the person you'd lifted up had started looking at you from a height as if you were nothing more than the ground he left behind. Still, I stayed silent. I congratulated him, asked polite questions, listened to stories about colleagues I'd never meet. I carried the pride he expected of me and hid the ache he would never see. Because in my mind, I believed respect, once built, could not be erased. I was wrong. It was a Thursday evening when the first photo appeared on my screen. I hadn't been looking for it. It came from the casual cruelty of scrolling through a feed, the way the world now delivers its news without warning. There he was, my son, seated at a long table draped in white linen, silver cutlery glinting under warm lights. The caption read, "An unforgettable evening with our corporate family." I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the screen, my reflection faint in the glass. My phone had been silent all day. No call, no text, no mention that the company was hosting a dinner for the families of its employees. I was not considered part of that definition, not for the company, and it seemed not for him. In the picture, he wore a navy suit I had helped him buy years ago when his paycheck wasn't yet enough for tailoring. His smile was confident, polished, the smile of a man who belonged exactly where he was. Around him sat people laughing, leaning in, sharing toasts. Beside him was an empty chair, empty only because the moment had been caught between movements, but I couldn't help seeing it as something else, a seat I would never be offered. I thought about the years when we celebrated every milestone together, no matter how small. The cheap dinners at the corner diner when he closed his first minor deal, the late-night takeout on the living room floor when he lost one and needed someone to remind him it wasn't the end. We'd shared the wins and the losses as if both were sacred. Now, those moments had been replaced with tables where my name wasn't even considered for the guest list. I told myself maybe it was an oversight. Maybe he assumed I wouldn't want to come. But beneath those soft excuses, I felt the truth. The man in that photo was no longer looking over his shoulder to see if I was there. He no longer thought my presence could add anything to his world. I zoomed in on the image until it blurred, until his face dissolved into pixels, and the room became just light and shadow. But even then, the feeling didn't fade. I had spent years building him up, ensuring he never felt the loneliness of standing outside a closed door. And now I was standing there myself, staring through the glass at a life I had helped make possible, but could no longer touch. That night I didn't call him. I didn't ask why. I simply set my phone face down on the table and listened to the quiet of my own house. Outside, the streetlight flickered, casting light in uneven waves, like the pulse of something fading. And I realized the distance between us was no longer growing. It was already complete. It was late winter when the call came, the kind of day where the air feels heavy even indoors, and the walls seem to press in with the weight of unspoken things. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I thought, foolishly, instinctively, that it might be him. It wasn't. It was an old acquaintance. Someone who'd once worked with us both in the early years, back when ambition still had warmth to it. His voice carried that uneasy tone people use when they're about to deliver news they don't want to own. "I thought you should hear it from me," he said. "Your son, he's out." The words were followed by a pause, as if he was waiting for me to react, to gasp, to ask the flood of questions he knew would come. But I didn't. I just listened. He explained it in blunt strokes. No warning, no graceful exit, no final handshake. Just a meeting that ended before lunch, a short escort down the corridor by security, and a cardboard box containing what little was left of his professional life. A framed photo, a couple of pens, the branded mug every employee got on their first day, years reduced to objects you could carry in one arm. I imagined him walking out of that glass tower into the gray of the city afternoon, the shine of his suit dulled by the weight of what had happened. The same revolving door he'd once entered with pride, now spinning him out into the street without ceremony. People passing by wouldn't know the difference. Another man in a suit with a box. But I knew. I could see the crack in his world forming, the kind that doesn't just let light in, but lets something essential leak out. The friend on the line spoke of office politics and budget cuts, but his voice faltered when I pressed on the real reason. It was power, pure and simple. Someone wanted him gone. Maybe he'd challenged the wrong person. Maybe he'd been too confident in rooms where confidence was currency and the price had just been collected. When the call ended, I stayed in my chair for a long while. I didn't feel the triumph some might expect. There was no vindication, no satisfaction in knowing the son who once told me I didn't belong had been pushed out of the very world he thought I could never enter. Instead, there was a quiet ache, a recognition of how quickly the ground beneath us can shift, no matter how high we stand. I wanted to reach for the phone, to call him, to tell him that I knew exactly how that kind of fall felt. The sudden loss of place, the silence after the noise, but I didn't, because I knew he wouldn't answer, not yet. Pride builds walls as high as ambition does, and both can be just as isolating. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, I thought of something I had learned long ago, in business and in life. When the fall comes, it doesn't matter how hard you hit the ground. What matters is whether you stand up before anyone sees you crawl. I suspected my son wasn't ready to stand yet, but I also knew this. When he finally did, he might look up and realize that I was already there, standing where he never expected me to be. I called him the day after I heard the news. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon, once more in the quiet stretch before midnight when the world feels thinner and people are more likely to let their guard down. Each time the call rang until it dissolved into voicemail. The same polished voice recording he'd made months ago, back when his days were full of meetings, and the sound of his phone was something he welcomed. Now it was a wall. I didn't leave a message. What could I say? "I heard you fell. I'm here if you need me." Those words feel different when they come from someone you once dismissed. Pride has a way of twisting even kindness into something sharp. I knew the weight of those words he'd spoken to me. "You don't belong in business," still hung between us like iron. and I knew that hearing my voice now might only press that weight harder onto him. Shame builds walls faster than anger. Anger can shout and burn itself out, but shame is silent and efficient. It bricks you in from the inside until you can't even see who's outside trying to help. I imagined him in his apartment, the blinds drawn, the phone face down on the table, the taste of failure bitter and unfamiliar in his mouth. He had lived years in forward motion, never considering that the road might stop, and now he was stalled, and every inch of that silence was echoing back at him. I thought about driving over, knocking on his door, forcing the conversation, but I remembered the look in his eyes that day in my doorway, when he told me I didn't belong. It wasn't just dismissal, it was certainty. To face me now would mean facing the possibility that certainty had been wrong. That's not something you do the day after you've been pushed out of the building you thought you'd spend your life in. So I waited. Not idly, but quietly. There's a kind of patience that comes with age, the understanding that some wounds can't be treated until they've stopped bleeding. And while I waited, I started noticing how the silence between us wasn't just about him anymore. It was space. Space for me to think about all the years I had spent being the quiet helper, the background figure, the unacknowledged foundation. In that silence, a different kind of thought began to take shape. Not revenge, not yet. Something more deliberate, more measured. I had spent a lifetime making sure he had a place to stand. Now I began to wonder what it would feel like to build something of my own again, something that reminded us both where I truly belonged. The first rumor reached me in the form of a casual remark over coffee with an old colleague. It was disguised as small talk, the way dangerous truths often are. I heard it wasn't about performance, he said, stirring sugar into his cup, eyes never quite meeting mine, more like clearing space for someone else. Space. After that, the whispers began to take shape. They came from different corners: a former client, a junior employee who owed me a favor, a receptionist with a sharp memory and sharper ears. The details shifted, depending on the teller, but the core stayed the same. My son's firing had little to do with his work and everything to do with someone else's ambition. A director's nephew, fresh out of some overpriced university, was being brought in. A seat at the table had to be cleared, and my son's happened to be the one they chose. It wasn't incompetence that had ended him. It was the same ruthless current that has run through business since the first deal was made behind closed doors. And I knew that current well. I had swum in it, been pulled under by it, and once or twice learned how to let it carry me somewhere useful. But my son had never seen it coming. He had believed in merit, in the idea that skill and effort would always protect him. He had believed in the rules, not knowing they could be rewritten at any moment by those who owned the paper. As I pieced together the fragments, a strange mixture of feelings settled over me. There was anger, yes, not for the loss of his job, but for the way it had been done. No warning, no dignity, no acknowledgement of the years he had given, just a decision made in a room he wasn't in, by people who would never know what it felt like to be on the other side of it. But beneath the anger was something colder, sharper: recognition. I understood the players in this game because I had once been one of them. I knew the way they moved, the language they used when they wanted to disguise a knife as a handshake. And for the first time in years, I felt that old instinct wake up in me, the one that doesn't just endure betrayal, but learns how to turn it into leverage. I didn't call him to tell him what I'd heard. He wasn't ready to hear it, and I wasn't ready to reveal that I was listening. Instead, I stored every whisper, every name, every detail. Because in business, as in life, information is currency, and I had just been handed my first deposit in years. The men who had pushed my son out thought they had erased him. They didn't know they had just drawn my attention. And I, unlike my son, had no illusions about how far I would go when someone opened a door like this for me. It came on a Tuesday evening, just as the light outside was fading into that deep, uncertain blue that makes the world feel quieter than it really is. My phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in decades, a man who, in another life, had been my fiercest competitor and somehow one of the few I truly respected. We had built and broken deals together, shared late-night coffee in airports between meetings, and understood that trust in business is rare, but not impossible. My son had never heard his name. He didn't know the history, the shared scars, or the long ledger of favors quietly kept between us. His voice was older now, worn at the edges like a banknote that had passed through too many hands. But the directness was still there. After a few pleasantries, both of us aware that the small talk was just tradition, he told me why he was calling. The company where my son had worked, the one that had tossed him out without ceremony, was struggling. Not publicly, not yet. On the outside, the glass tower still shone and the executives still smiled for photos. But inside, the cracks were widening. Revenues down. Investor confidence slipping. Quiet meetings in back rooms where words like acquisition and asset sell-off were spoken in low voices. "They're looking for buyers," he said plainly. "The kind that won't spook the market. And they're desperate enough to consider options they'd never have looked at before." I sat there, leaning back in my chair, letting the weight of that sink in. This wasn't just news. This was an opening. A small one, but in business, that's all you ever really need. I pictured the boardroom where those decisions were being whispered, the same one where my son had once believed the air was too rarefied for someone like me. And now, they were quietly putting up a for sale sign, hoping the right kind of buyer would come along before the wrong kind found out. I didn't tell my friend about my son's history with the company. That was my card to hold, not his to see. I listened, asked the questions that mattered. Who was talking to whom? How much debt they were carrying? Which investors were getting restless? Which departments were most likely to be cut? He gave me enough to sketch the outline, and I could already feel my mind filling in the rest. When the call ended, I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, the phone still warm in my hand. My thoughts were steady, not rushed. This wasn't about revenge, not in the way most people think of it. This was about balance, about stepping into a game I'd been told I wasn't fit to play. And not just playing, but winning in a way that no one could ignore. For years I had watched from the sidelines, convinced my time had passed. Now, here was the ball, rolling toward me across an open field. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the old fire move through me, the one that reminded me I hadn't just belonged in business. I had once been dangerous in it. For days after that call, I carried the thought with me like a stone in my pocket. Heavy, solid, impossible to forget. Every morning I'd sit with my coffee, the steam curling in front of me, and I'd turn the idea over in my mind. I could walk away. I could let the company sink into the hands of strangers who would strip it for parts, carve it up, and leave nothing but a hollow nameplate behind. It wasn't my fight, not officially, and no one would expect me, the man who'd been quietly written out of the picture, to step into it now. But something had shifted. Not the kind of fire that comes from anger, quick and bright and gone in an instant, but a slower burn, the kind that eats away at old doubts until all that's left is clarity. This wasn't about humiliating my son, or proving to him that I could win where he had lost. It was about something much deeper, something I had buried without even realizing it. It was about reclaiming the truth of who I was, the man I had been before years of quiet sacrifice had convinced me I belonged on the sidelines. There was a time when I could walk into a room full of men who thought they were smarter, richer, untouchable, and leave with the deal they didn't even know they'd given me. A time when my word carried weight without needing to be loud. I had been sharp once, dangerous even, in a way that was invisible until it mattered. Somewhere along the way, I had let that part of myself fade, trading the battlefield of business for the quiet safety of family. And in doing so, I had forgotten that safety isn't the same thing as respect. As the days passed, I found myself looking at the company not as my son's former employer, but as a chessboard already in motion. I could see the weak pieces, the overextended plays, the blind spots. The opening was there, small, but real. And if I moved now, I could take it before anyone else even realized it was vulnerable. Still, there was the question, why now? Why step back into the arena after all these years? The answer came in a way I hadn't expected. One night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I thought about the day my son told me I didn't belong in business. The words had stung, yes, but not because they were cruel. They stung because, in that moment, I realized I had stopped believing I did belong. That was the real wound, and wounds like that don't heal on their own. I knew then that I had only two choices: let the rest of my life be defined by that quiet surrender, or take one more swing at the world that had once been mine, not for him, not even for the company, for me. And so the decision was made, not with a sudden rush of adrenaline, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who knows the cost and is ready to pay it. I would move. I would buy the company. And when it was done, no one, not my son, not the board, not the investors, would ever again question whether I belonged. I began quietly, the way all serious moves in business begin, not with public declarations, but with late-night calls and discreet meetings in corners no one was watching. My first step was to take inventory, not of the company's assets, but of my own. The years had taken much, but they hadn't taken everything. I still had investments tucked away, properties I could liquidate without notice, accounts that had been growing quietly in the background while the world thought I'd retired. More importantly, I still had people, the kind who didn't need contracts to keep their word, because they remembered mine. One by one, I reached out to them. Old colleagues, former partners, even a rival or two who had learned to respect me in the only way that matters in business, through losses they'd never forgotten. Some were surprised to hear from me, but most weren't. They had always known I might come back. And when I told them what I wanted, not why, not the story behind it, just the move itself, they didn't ask for more. They trusted the silence between my words. I met one man in the back of a quiet restaurant, where the lights were low and the tables too far apart for eavesdropping. Another I visited in his office after hours, where the only sound was the ticking of a clock older than both of us. I didn't have to convince them with speeches. My handshake was enough. They could feel the weight of my intention, and they understood that when I set my mind to something, it wasn't a gamble. It was an inevitability. The capital came together faster than even I expected. Decades of reputation condensed into numbers on paper. A war chest built not from reckless loans or desperate partnerships, but from relationships forged in a time when your name was your bond. Every dollar I raised felt heavier than its face value because it carried the weight of people's faith in me. Faith I had earned long before my son had ever worn a suit. When the sum was ready, I called my old friend, the one who had first told me the company was in trouble. I told him the amount. He whistled low and said, "That'll get their attention." I didn't tell him the truth, that I didn't want their attention, not yet. The offer would go in quietly, unannounced, sliding across the right desk at the right moment, when the board was tired and the numbers were grim enough to make them see me not as a threat, but as a lifeline. A few days later, it happened. No press release, no grand reveal. Just a set of signed papers delivered in an envelope with my name written in discreet black ink. I imagined them opening it, scanning the terms, realizing the offer was clean, solid, and exactly what they needed. They wouldn't know yet who I really was to them. That would come later. For now, I was simply the answer to a problem they didn't want anyone else to see. And as I placed the pen back on my desk, after signing the final authorization, I felt a stillness settle over me. The kind of stillness you feel before the first move of a game you already know how to win. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of day when the office corridors feel half asleep, when the hum of the air conditioning is louder than the conversations, and everyone is already thinking about the weekend. The boardroom was nearly empty, except for the three people who mattered in that moment: the company's legal counsel, the representative from the investors, and me. The blinds were drawn halfway, letting in just enough light to cast long shadows across the polished table. There was no ceremony, no gathering of executives in tailored suits, no polite applause or staged handshakes for the press. Just a stack of papers neatly aligned in front of me, their weight not from the paper itself, but from what they carried, the authority to take control of the very company that had once treated my son as disposable. I ran my fingers lightly over the top page, feeling the texture of the embossed letterhead. The lawyer cleared his throat, sliding the pen toward me. It was a fine pen, heavy, designed to look important in photographs that would never be taken. I picked it up slowly, letting the silence stretch for just a moment longer. In that pause, I thought of everything that had brought me here. The years of quiet work no one saw, the sacrifices that had faded from memory, the sting of hearing my own son say I didn't belong in the world I had once helped build. And then I wrote my name. Stroke after stroke, steady and deliberate, the ink gliding across the page with the finality of a locked door. The sound was soft, just the faint scratch of the nib, but it was louder to me than any applause could have been. When the last loop of my signature was complete, I set the pen down, not with triumph, but with a calm certainty that the ground beneath us had shifted. The counsel reached forward, sliding the signed documents back toward his side of the table. "That's it," he said quietly. And it was. Years of my life reduced to a moment, and a future rewritten in the space between breaths. I didn't linger. I didn't walk the halls or look at the faces of the employees who had no idea their world had just changed. This was not the moment for appearances. Ownership doesn't begin with a speech. It begins with a decision, and mine had been made long before I stepped into that room. As I left the building, the late afternoon sun caught the glass of the tower, turning it into a mirror. For a second, I saw my reflection. Older, yes, but still the man who knew how to move quietly in a loud world. The man my son thought no longer existed. What he didn't know was that I had just taken my first step back into the arena. And now I wasn't coming to play. I was coming to win. The announcement went out on a Monday morning, timed perfectly for the start of the work week, when inboxes are full and minds are focused on what lies ahead. It was just a few lines, sent from the corporate communications team, but it carried the weight of an earthquake. Effective immediately, our new owner will be Mr. Last Name. No photograph, no biography, just a name. My name. I wasn't in the building when they read it. I didn't need to be. I could imagine the way it spread, first as a small ripple, then as a current that swept through every department, from the polished glass offices at the top to the buzzing cubicles below. I knew how it would sound in the hushed conversations near the coffee machines, in the hurried texts between colleagues who were suddenly remembering old rumors about me. And then my phone started buzzing. Not from my son, not yet. Instead, the messages came from people who had once walked past me at events without more than a nod, people who had spoken to me only when they needed something, people who had forgotten I was even a player in this game. Their words were a mix of surprise, curiosity, and something else, a sudden respect that wasn't there before. Congratulations. Heard the news. Incredible move. Didn't see this coming, but it makes sense now. Each ping was a reminder of how quickly the world recalculates its respect when you hold the keys to something it values. It wasn't bitterness that I felt reading them. It was observation. These were the same people who had once overlooked me, not out of cruelty, but because I had made myself too easy to overlook. Now, they couldn't. My name was in their inboxes, in their meetings, in their whispered speculations about what this would mean. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I pictured my son opening that email. I wondered if he read it once, or twice, or 3 times, trying to decide if it could possibly be the same man he had told didn't belong in business. I imagined the quiet that would follow, the way the walls of certainty crack when faced with a truth you didn't see coming. I didn't call him. Not yet. Timing is everything, in business and in life. This wasn't the moment to explain, or to remind him of the words he'd once thrown at me. This was the moment to let the reality settle in. To let the idea of me as the owner of his former kingdom take root in his mind, quietly and deeply. By the end of the day, the messages slowed. The shock had worn off, replaced by the calculated interest of people figuring out how to align themselves with the new order. And through it all, I sat at my desk at home, watching the winter light fade through the window, knowing this was only the beginning. I hadn't bought the company to make a statement, but now that the statement was made, I wasn't going to waste it. A week passed after the announcement, each day quiet on the surface but alive beneath, like a river running deep under ice. My phone never once lit up with his name. I knew it wouldn't. Pride and uncertainty are twin anchors, and my son had both weighing him down. But I also knew something else. You can't avoid a door forever when you suspect what's waiting on the other side. On a Sunday evening, as the last of the light faded into that muted gray that makes the city feel older, I took out my phone. I didn't rehearse the words, didn't try to soften them. I simply typed, "Meet me in the conference room at 10 a.m. Monday." No greeting, no explanation, just a time and a place. I hit send and set the phone down. I didn't need to add which conference room. He knew. Everyone in that building knew the one. The glass-walled room on the top floor, with its sweeping view of the city skyline. It was the same room where deals were signed, careers were made, and, in his case, where decisions about his exit might very well have been discussed without him present. I wanted him to walk into that room again, but not as the employee called in to face his fate. This time, the power dynamic would be entirely different. That night, I imagined the moment he'd read the message. I pictured him sitting at his kitchen table, the glow of the screen reflected in his eyes, wondering if he should reply, wondering if he even wanted to know what I had to say. I knew the battle inside him, part of him wanting to delete the message and keep his distance, part of him too curious to stay away. Curiosity wins more battles than courage ever does. I didn't sleep much, not out of anxiety, but because I could feel the weight of the moment approaching, and moments like that don't come often. When they do, you want to be awake for all of them. The hours until morning felt deliberate, every tick of the clock pulling the meeting closer, every breath a reminder of how far we'd traveled from that rainy Tuesday when he told me I didn't belong in business. At 9:45 a.m. the next day, I was already in the building. I walked past employees who straightened their posture when they saw me, past conversations that paused as I passed, past curious eyes that followed me into the elevator. When the doors opened on the top floor, the hush was different here, quieter, heavier, the way air feels before a storm. I stepped into the conference room alone, letting the silence fill the space. The table gleamed under the morning light, the skyline beyond the glass, stretching endlessly. This was no longer just a room. It was a stage, and at 10 o'clock sharp, he would walk into it. The door opened slowly, as if the hinges themselves sensed the weight of what was about to pass through them. He stepped inside, cautious, his movements measured in that way people move when they're trying not to betray the fact that their heart is beating faster than they'd like. His eyes swept the room, the skyline, the polished table, the empty chairs, before they landed on me, seated at the head. For a moment he didn't speak. It was as if he was rearranging the world in his mind, trying to make sense of why I was here, in this seat, in this room, the same room where he had once believed he belonged more than I ever could. "Dad," he said finally, the word carrying an edge of disbelief, "what are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted the silence to stretch, to let him feel the space between the man he thought I was and the man sitting in front of him now. Without breaking his gaze, I reached for the folder in front of me, opened it, and slid the top document across the gleaming surface toward him. The sound of paper against wood was quiet, but it might as well have been thunder. He glanced down at it, and I watched his eyes catch on the bold, unmistakable header, the acquisition agreement. He flipped the first page, scanned the lines, then stopped at the signature. My name. Not typed, signed. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened. "I own the company now," I said, my voice steady, carrying none of the heat or triumph he might have expected. I wanted him to hear it not as a boast, but as a simple fact, a truth that didn't need embellishment. The air in the room seemed to shift. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could see the war behind his eyes, pride clashing with disbelief, disbelief giving way to something heavier. Regret, perhaps, not just for the words he'd once thrown at me, but for never having looked closely enough to see what I was capable of. I leaned back in my chair, not to distance myself, but to give him the space to absorb it. I wasn't here to humiliate him. I wasn't here to lecture him. I was here to let the reality stand on its own, to let him feel the gravity of a truth he could no longer deny. I'd not only belonged in business, I had just claimed the very ground he'd been pushed from. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent to the quiet reckoning happening in that glass-walled room. But inside, everything had shifted. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, of things neither of us could yet bring ourselves to say. He kept staring at the papers, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something less impossible. His hands rested on either side of the folder, unmoving, the way you hold on to something when you're not sure if it's an anchor or a weight. I could see the questions in his eyes. How? When? Why? But I didn't rush to fill the silence. Some truths don't need to be explained. They need to be felt. I didn't gloat. I didn't lean forward and remind him of that rainy Tuesday, of the doorway where he'd looked me in the eye and told me I didn't belong in business. I didn't list the sacrifices he'd forgotten, the years I'd spent building foundations he'd mistaken for invisible ground. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that the man he thought was finished was sitting in the seat he once occupied, not by accident, not by charity, but because I had claimed it. "Son," I said at last, my voice quiet but carrying across the space between us, "never tell someone they don't belong, especially when they built the road you walk on." The words hung there, steady and unmoving until they sank in. I saw it happen, the flicker in his gaze, the small tightening at the corners of his eyes, the shift in his breathing. His pride was still there, but pride can't erase the truth when it's staring you in the face. And in that moment, he wasn't looking at just his father. He was looking at the man behind every opportunity he'd ever had, the man he'd underestimated, the man who had never stopped belonging, not in business, not in life. His eyes glistened, though he didn't let the tears fall. We didn't need them. Respect doesn't always come with apologies, and forgiveness doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it's just a quiet acknowledgement, a meeting of eyes across a table where everything has already been said. I leaned back, giving him the space to take it in. The city stretched out beyond the glass, sunlight breaking between clouds, casting the room in a shifting glow. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. This wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't about ownership or victory. It was about something far rarer, far harder to win. Respect, restored, undeniable, and finally ours. And as we sat there, across from one another, I knew the seat I was in had always been mine. I'd just chosen until now to let someone else keep it warm.